everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich, and I'm the Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at the Korea Economic Institute. It is my pleasure to welcome you here today for our academic paper series event on the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit and South Korea's place in the global nuclear order. We are excited to have Miles Pomper, Senior Research Associate at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, with us here today to talk about his paper on these issues. President Obama has emphasized nuclear weapons issues during his presidency, and this was clearly seen in his 2009 Prague speech calling for a nuclear weapon-free world, and with the formation of the Nuclear Security Summit in 2010. And then South Korea stepped forward to host the second Nuclear Security Summit, which was just held in March. And there's been some discussion and analysis out there on the advantages and disadvantages of the Nuclear Security Summit process, as well as how effective some of the pledges and house gifts from various countries will be on enhancing nuclear security. So really glad to have Miles Pomper and have him write a academic paper for us, and he's here today to talk us through some of these issues and give us his analysis on the outcomes of the Nuclear Security Summit and the impact for South Korea on future nuclear matters. Miles Pomper is a Senior Research Associate at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in their office here in Washington, D.C. And many of you have probably read his excellent writings in numerous books, articles, and other publications. Before joining the center, he served as Editor-in-Chief of Arms Control Today from 2003 to 2009. And previously, he was the lead foreign policy reporter for CQ Weekly and Legislate News Service, where he covered the full range of national security issues before Congress. And he was also a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Information Agency. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Miles Pomper. Miles?
Thanks, Nicholas. Thanks to all of you for coming here, and please continue to enjoy your lunch while I speak. It's a pleasure to be back at KEI. I've had a very good interaction with this organization over the last few years, especially on these issues of Korea's nuclear program, which is growing as we speak. I think actually June 1st, Korea is about to launch two nuclear plants are going to come online in Korea. So this is the fifth largest nuclear power program in the world, and it continues growing both domestically and in terms of its exports. So, as Nicholas said, I'm going to talk about the Seoul Nuclear Security Summit, both in terms of its relevance to the world of nuclear security, and then also its relevance to Korea in a more general sense. And I think there's gains in both areas, but there's also limitations on what's happened. So, the question is really how much of a success was the summit? There's obviously some steps forward, but there's a lot that needs to be done in both areas, and a lot that could be done. So, just give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. First, just to give you a little background on, why do we have these nuclear security summits? What's the threat that we're dealing with? Why is this important to have these meetings? Secondly, why did this take place in Seoul? Then look particularly at the summit itself. What were its successes? What were its setbacks? Both in terms of nuclear security and in terms of South Korean interests. Where do we see this process going for the Nuclear Security Summit process? Both in 2014, where the Netherlands has been designated as the next host of the summit, and also what does this mean sort of for Korea going forward? You were right about that clicker. Here's this. All right. So let's talk about why we have these summits. The first summit was held in Washington in 2010, and the reason President Obama called for such a summit in his famous 2009 Prague speech calling for a world without nuclear weapons. He talked about a lot of different nuclear issues in that speech, but one of the issues was nuclear terrorism. And the reason we need to have these summits is because there's a lot of fissile material that is highly enriched uranium or plutonium, which can be used in nuclear weapons, but is also used in some applications in the civil sector, in ordinary use in commercial use or other use among non-military users. And the idea is to try to reduce the use of that material, particularly the highly enriched uranium, in the civil sector, to minimize that use wherever possible and to secure the materials that are still in use. Highly enriched uranium is a particular problem and one I spend a lot of time on because this is the easiest material for a terrorist to make a bomb out of. If you look at the bomb that went off over Nagasaki in 1945, that was a weapon made of highly enriched uranium. It uses a very simple design, a gun-type design, where basically one bullet of highly enriched uranium is shot into an empty sphere of highly enriched uranium. Together they become a critical mass and they make an explosion. This is not a complicated design. In fact, it was so simple it was never tested before the weapon was dropped on Nagasaki. And there's this material on, there was a number of programs beginning in the 1950s where this material, both from the United States and the Soviet Union, was sent all over the world as part of these Atoms for Peace and a similar program in Russia, where the idea was, if we show that there's all these peaceful uses for nuclear energy and nuclear research, then people will see that it's okay to have nuclear energy and sort of okay for us to have nuclear weapons, essentially, that there are positive uses for this material. And it's ended up going, thousands of kilograms of this material were sent around the world. There's still about 70 tons of this material estimated in the civil sector around the world, and only 25 kilograms of uranium-235 is needed to produce a nuclear weapon, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So you're talking huge scale of material, not that much needed for a weapon. And I should say, just to define what highly enriched uranium is for you, natural uranium has less than 1% of the U-235 material that I mentioned, the material that can actually fission and cause a chain reaction. A nuclear power plant has only about 3 to 5% of this U-235 in it. On the other hand, anything above 20% U-235 of the mix of uranium is classified as highly enriched uranium. Nuclear weapons usually have about 90% U-235. And there's different levels of HEU at some of these facilities, but there's quite a bit of this material that's actually 90%, and even the material that's less, if you had sufficient quantities, could be used for weapons anyway. So this is dangerous stuff, and we need to, as much as possible, eliminate it or minimize it. So at Washington, we had this meeting. It was the first meeting. The thing to keep in mind in nuclear security is that, unlike other areas of nuclear governance, that's safeguards, which many of you may be familiar with from dealing with Iran or North Korea. That's where the IAEA goes in and investigates to make sure that countries don't take their declared materials and use them for weapons, or nuclear safety, which is making sure that things like Fukushima don't happen. Nuclear security is the governance structure, the rules, the international regulations on this are not very strong or comprehensive. There's a lot of holes in the regime. There's a real patchwork. And so the president saw this. This is actually something that President Obama has been interested in even when he was a member of Congress. One of his major legislative accomplishments was to work on this issue with Senator Lugar from Indiana. And so he wanted to have an initiative to move forward what had been, primarily U.S. efforts to address this problem, and which had only been kind of stuck in the bureaucratic levels of, our bureaucrats dealing with their bureaucrats, and trying to get this up to a level where you could get some political input to get the presidents and leaders of countries to buy in and make this an issue that we would all deal with. And I would say on that level, he succeeded. I think it really brought new attention. We had the largest gathering here in Washington in 2010 of world leaders since the founding of the United Nations in 1945. We also, the initiatives got advanced in terms of particular countries committing to take actions. And these included things like minimizing the highly enriched uranium, opening, like Korea opened a center of excellence on nuclear security, or pledged to open a security, so did Japan. We had various kinds of commitments to funding for the International Atomic Energy Agency in this area, and so on. So there's a lot of what are called house gifts, individual commitments by states that were quite useful. There was also a communique and a work plan, which were frankly less useful. These were very general statements of principle, but that were so watered down in trying to get kind of a consensus document, which you try to get at these kind of international affairs, that there wasn't a lot of meat to them. So the most successful part of the summit was actually these house gifts. When the summit process was started by the U.S., the expectation, frankly, was that Russia, which is got the most amount of this material, and obviously with the U.S. was the other nuclear superpower, and has been cooperating with the U.S. on some programs to return material from former Soviet satellites or states to Russia, would host the next summit. But the Russians decided not to do that. Partly there was a presidential election this year. I'm not sure all the other reasons, but maybe they didn't want to spotlight on the fact that they're a lot of the problem. In any case, the Russians decided not to do it, and the Korean president stepped forward. I think partly he has a very strong relationship with President Obama, and I think also that President Lee's had an idea of Korea as a global Korea, as a bigger actor in global affairs, and he saw this as an opportunity for Korea to make a mark on the global stage. It had hosted the G20 meeting quite successfully in 2010. In addition, as I mentioned, Korea has a growing nuclear industry. This was an opportunity for Korea to introduce people around the world to its nuclear industry, make people comfortable with them, establish its bona fides as a good actor in the international community. So Korea agreed to do it. Everyone kind of said, Korea, they don't have any of these materials, but okay, glad someone's going to hold it. And then the Korean government had to figure out, okay, what do we do with this now that we're actually hosting this? How do we, what's our mission? I mean, this had been a U.S. process, and what's our role here? You had Korea had to contend with the fact that, frankly, most of the countries other than the United States tend to downplay the importance of this issue. You've got some countries like Russia or Pakistan, which are nuclear security problems, but they want to downplay, don't worry about it. It's not a big problem. So they downplay the importance of this issue. Then you've got some countries, particularly developing countries, that say, look, we've got people who can't eat, people who can't get health care. What do we worry about nuclear terrorism? This is abstract. And this is kind of the U.S. going crazy after 9/11 and worrying about everything. So Korea had to contend with those issues. And also, as I said, Korea's not so worried about this. I mean, a lot of other countries say, well, if there's going to be a nuclear terrorism attack, they're going to attack the U.S., right? They're not going to attack us, which may not be true, but that's sort of a lot of the feeling around the world. And Korea doesn't have this material. It's been pretty good on the nuclear security issue, even coming into the summit. And Korea, obviously, on nuclear matters, is far more concerned with North Korea and what it's doing, and then the issue of nuclear safety after Fukushima. Everyone in Korea obviously got very worried about, are our plants safe? So it had to carve out an agenda that dealt with that ambivalence in the world community about the threat, and also tried to adhere to its own interests, but also kept going with what the U.S. had initiated in 2010 and worked with its U.S. partner. So I think, in many ways, the summit was a success in steering this kind of agenda. I think the biggest success was, Korea in some ways labeled this an implementation summit. There were all these specific commitments I mentioned, these national commitments, these house gifts that were made by individual countries to do individual things. And pretty much all these were followed through. We had one of the groups that I work with a lot in this Fissile Material Working Group Coalition that Jen here is part of. A couple of these groups put together a report detailing what countries had done, and I think it was 80% of the commitments had been accomplished shortly before this, by some point a few weeks ahead of the summit. and almost all the other ones were in process. So, I would say I'll talk about a couple of them the U.S. and Korea haven't done later in that regard, but I think on the whole, these things really move forward. Korea also got to address its domestic concerns. There was, the safety issue didn't have as much a focus as Korea might have liked initially, but it was part of the summit. There was a discussion of the interface between safety and security, where, this was the kind of compromise between the U.S., which really didn't want to focus too much on safety at all, and Korea, which wanted to focus on it more, which is let's look at the areas where safety and security overlap. I mean, if you have a nuclear accident, whether it's by a terrorist, attacking a plant, or a nature, tsunami coming in and destroying the generators, then you've got problems. So how do we deal with these problems that correspond to both areas, and how do we prevent them, and how do we make sure that the security things that we prevent people from getting access to a plant don't prevent the emergency rescue teams from getting in if there's an accident. So how do we get these things to work together and for everyone's benefit? So that's kind of the interface issue. It also, if you look at the communique that came out, the Seoul communique, talks about spent fuel safety. This is, this became an issue in Fukushima. That what happens? Is there a danger that if you take the cooling out, you're going to have, or there's some sort of fire or attack, or plane crashes in or something, you're going to have the spent fuel get on fire and cause a problem. So the issue of spent fuel safety is also mentioned in the communique. Another one of the more concrete commitments that came out of Seoul was a commitment by all the countries to push for entry into force of a particular treaty, which is, it's a long name. There was a thing called the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, which was dating back several decades. And this was a treaty that talked about making sure that nuclear material was protected while it was in international transit. After 9/11, the U.S. led an effort to push through an amendment which talked about how states should make sure that material is protected in country. And this was approved in 2005. So this is the 2005 amendment to the CPPNM, if you want to speak jargon. And in the Seoul communique, states committed to try to get this to enter into force by 2014. For it to enter into force, 2/3 of the countries that are parties to the original convention have to be parties to the amendment. And that's something like 140-something countries are now parties to the original convention. So you're talking about 90-something countries that need to be parties to the amendment. Only something like 40 to 50 countries are now parties, and many of the countries that at the Nuclear Security Summit were not parties to the amendment, including the United States and Korea yet, which is a problem. Another innovation that came out of Seoul was what are called gift baskets. This took this concept of house gifts and expanded it even further so that groups of states could pledge to take steps rather than individual countries and individual actions. These touched on some new areas. Radiological material. This is material not material that goes into nuclear weapons, but could go into dirty bombs. This is, dirty bombs are bombs that take, material that's radioactive and combine it with a conventional explosion to disperse it. They're not going to kill hundreds of thousands of people, but they're going to cause some injuries directly from the explosion, and then, maybe long-term problems from cancer and other things, contaminate areas, impose economic costs, and so on. And these are generally regarded as more, nuclear terrorism is considered, a much more dangerous threat, but less likely, whereas dirty bombs are considered more likely and less dangerous. Another issue is information security. That's things like protecting nuclear plants from cyber attack, or the information about how to build certain devices or create certain problems. There was an effort to gift basket on efforts to combat nuclear smuggling, taking the material out. A lot of the material, for instance, that we know that's been smuggled has come from Russia and then been smuggled out through the Caucasus and so on. So efforts to combat that kind of smuggling. And then there were steps on minimizing the use of highly enriched uranium. One big step was that Ukraine cleaned out essentially all of its highly enriched uranium, moved it back to Russia. And this has been something that some of us have been working on for well over a decade. There was an agreement signed by Korea and 3 other countries to cooperate on research into what's called high-density, low-enriched uranium. Certain research reactors can't be converted right now from highly enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium because they need a high number of neutrons coming out. And the only way you're going to get that is to pack more uranium into the same space. To do that, you need to develop new fuels, new technologies. And Korea has been very helpful in the technology in this process. And this was an effort by Korea and some United States and some European states to collaborate more on testing and working these issues. And then there's the issue of medical isotopes, which is a lot of the technology that's used in certain heart scans and cancer scans and so on has traditionally been using highly enriched uranium to produce the isotopes used in the scan. And there are technologies now that have been developed and they need to be engineered and so on to specific facilities, but that can do this with low enriched uranium. And Korea is actually going to be building a new facility near Busan, which is going to produce these materials from low enriched uranium. And then some European states committed at the summit to convert from highly enriched uranium to low enriched uranium. So that was a real step forward. So there's a few setbacks too, of course. As I mentioned, both Korea and the United States have not yet ratified 2 key treaties that were called for in the communique and that they said they would work on. One is the 2005 amendment to the CPPNM, which I mentioned, and then there's another convention called I just call it the Nuclear Terrorism Convention, but the abbreviation is the ICSANT, International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. They're all mouthfuls. And both countries have approved their legislators have approved the actual conventions, but for them to ratify it, to notify people and for it to be effective in their countries, they have to pass implementing legislation so that it becomes part of their criminal code, it becomes effective, and only after they do that can the governments then notify the depositories that the treaty has been ratified. My guess is that Korea may do this before the U.S. because the U.S. there's all sorts of issues involving the death penalty and so on in the U.S., which I can get more into in the Q&A if anyone's curious, but that have held this up for several years. I think Korea, I don't see those problems, and so I think hopefully Korea will be able to do that fairly shortly. There was also an effort led by the French and supported by the United States to put forward what are called HEU management guidelines. When you look at plutonium, which is the other material that's used for nuclear weapons, there's a series of voluntary guidelines that a number of the key states that have plutonium, France, Japan, the United States, the UK, have agreed to on how to manage and hopefully kind of lessen the holdings of these materials, provide transparency, and so on. There was an effort to do the same for highly enriched uranium. This was blocked by countries like Russia, some of the countries in the so-called non-aligned movement, that's developing countries like South Africa. They didn't want this to happen in the summit process. They said, well, let's deal with this in the IAEA, which also means effectively let's not deal with it because they also don't want it dealt with in the IAEA. They have other priorities and other issues. And I would say that the bigger problem had to do with kind of what the vision was going in, not so much on the Korean part. I mean, Korea did it. This is ultimately a U.S. agenda. And I think there's, these incremental steps that we got through gift baskets and house gifts and all these other kinds of gifts are very nice, but we need kind of a broader vision. And most particularly, we don't have in this areas, we don't have any, unlike nuclear safety or safeguards, we don't have any kind of agreed upon minimum legal standards. What the standard is for securing material can vary from country to country. There's some, IAEA has put out guidelines, but these are not mandatory for states to enforce. And there's no process where peer review or transparency where countries can say, if you're Japan and you're worried about Korea's nuclear security or vice versa, you can't go in and be sure that the other country is doing the right thing in those areas. There's no There's no international mechanism. You can't even say, okay, the IAEA has checked it out. There are some voluntary inspections that countries can agree to do, but there's no requirement that they do so. And I would say, what we really want to do, the initial Washington summit called for a 4-year effort to secure all vulnerable fissile materials. Now, I would say our ultimate goal shouldn't just be a 4-year effort. It should be to secure all vulnerable fissile materials and work backwards. And what do you need to do that? You need some standard of what securing and vulnerable mean, and you need some way of ensuring that that's actually taking place, and that's peer review and legal standards. So that's the nuclear security half of things. I would say on the South Korean half, in terms of what this meant for South Korean interests, I would say it was almost entirely a success. I think Korea was seen as, an influential player. It got to play a role on the global stage, certainly managed the summit in terms of just logistics and requirements, very well. Everything was very smooth. Everything went well. And I think it was also interesting, this was kind of taking place when North Korea was making all these, noises about missile tests and sort of fear of a nuclear test in the background. So it certainly made Korea look even better by comparison. Here's Korea being a responsible global citizen. Here's North Korea making trouble yet again. And then I think economically, you had a couple of things that were quite interesting. You had this industry summit, which there was 2 parallel meetings in addition to the actual summit itself. They were held the Friday before the summit. One was an experts meeting, which I participated in, of non-governmental experts, and then there was a meeting of industry folks, and it was called the Nuclear Industry Summit. And they were actually, I think they did a much better job than a similar meeting in Washington a couple of years ago, because they were very concrete. They laid out some specific things that they wanted to accomplish in areas like HEU minimization. I think that was a success, and just got, Korea was very good at getting the industry involved. And it also, just bringing all these governments there, all these industry people, was a real opportunity for Korea to showcase its nuclear industry and meet with potential clients. For instance, there was some deals and talk and opportunities with countries like Turkey and Finland and Vietnam and India. So I think on that side of things, it was very successful for Korea. So looking forward to 2014 in the Netherlands and beyond, I think what's interesting is you're starting to see a real divergence in goals so far, at least between the U.S. government, at least, and particularly the White House, and the Korean government. The U.S. government, I think partly because they've had some setbacks, with countries like Russia and so on, because they don't want to make this a permanent international process, and because there's not a lot of support for continuing the current process as it is beyond 2014, given these kind of incremental things. It's hard to justify bringing these leaders every 2 years, for just small house gifts. They'd like to kind of turn over responsibility of the summit on the summit conclusions and the momentum to other bodies such as the IAEA, maybe the Security Council, the UN Office of Disarmament Affairs. Korea, on the other hand, is actually more looking to find more of a kind of a long-term vision for nuclear security, looking at the strengthening of the international legal regime on nuclear security and issues like some sort of mandatory legal standards, peer review, and so on. And while they might be willing to switch, not have leaders meet every couple of years, they're also looking at maybe there's other options, maybe having leaders meet every 4 or 5 years, or maybe having lower level meetings, but every 2 years, ministers rather than presidents. So I think there's a little bit of a divergence in vision from the two countries right then. We'll have to see kind of where, the Dutch who are going to lead the 2014 summit are still kind of gearing up for what they think. And, these are the 3 countries that I think will matter in terms of deciding how the summit kind of goes forward. And obviously there'll be issues there in terms of, if President Obama's here or not. If it's President Romney, maybe he'd have a different take on how to do things. And so obviously in Korea too, is it the governing party or not the governing party? So in conclusion, I would say, the summit was a boost to South Korea, both in terms of its exports and in terms of its international reputation as a global citizen. I would say that this helps the U.S.-Korean relationship, which already is one of the strongest it's been in years, given the close relationship between the presidents, a convergence of views on issues like North Korea, the end of the agreement on trade going forward, and so on. But it may not help one of Korea's implicit goals, I think, in hosting the summit, which was trying to get more U.S. support for its position in ongoing negotiations over a new nuclear cooperation agreement. The U.S. and Korea have had a nuclear cooperation agreement in place for almost 40 years. It expires in 2014, and Korea is trying to get prior approval in this agreement to be able to go and engage in enrichment and what's called pyroprocessing, which is a particular form of reprocessing. And this is U.S. generally doesn't support giving non-nuclear weapon states either of these capabilities. So this is, so far there's been kind of a log jam generally on that issue. The Koreans, the agreement that may put this off for some time is the U.S. and Korea agreed in 2010 and signed an agreement in 2011 to carry out a 10-year feasibility study of pyroprocessing and its issues of technical feasibility, economic feasibility, and then its non-proliferation acceptability. So that's kind of pushed that issue past 2014. It may come up later, but I know, part of I think the implicit rationale for Korea willing to host the summit was to get leverage on this issue, but I think there's just too many other considerations for this to gain much ground. And I would say the ultimate legacy of the summit, obviously we will know for a little bit, it's a little too early, but I would say that two factors that will be pretty crucial are what happens in the elections in both countries. I mean, if it's President Obama and President Lee's party, I think a lot of those things are going to continue. If not, things may change and it may not be as important. I mean, particularly it's something as signature as a nuclear security summit. New leaders in the U.S. are they're usually reluctant to kind of take on some initiative over their predecessor. So they either at least have to brand it something new or come up with some new initiative. And then I would say the other issues will be, how do Korea and the U.S. both together in terms of their relationship and more broadly globally work on issues of nuclear security and nuclear nonproliferation going forward? And how does this kind of play into that broader question and narrative? It will determine how much of a legacy there is. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions.
Session now. We have microphones, so if you just raise your hand, state your name, and ask a question, please, we can get started. Maybe just to kind of start us off, Miles, what's Korea's role in the transition to 2014 to the Netherlands? Do they have to, you talked about some of the things like the CPP-NM and other issues. Do they have to push these, and how else can they help the Netherlands kind of get ready for what they have to do in 2014?
Well, it's a very informal process. So there's no formal role, so it kind of depends on what the Dutch want. But I mean, they've been talking to the Dutch about various issues, and I assume the sense is that there'll be some kind of troika, that there'll be kind of the U.S. and Koreans and the Dutch will kind of work together on managing this process in the lead up to the summit. I assume that Korea will be asked to help support things like getting this amendment in force and using its diplomats and so on to maybe do demarches or cooperate in some way. But that's partly, ultimately the Dutch have to decide, it's their call on these things.
Yeah. Questions? Yes, right here. Outside.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, private consultant. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about new generations of nuclear reactors that you may have come across in some of these side meetings at the summit. The problem seems to be the production of high or HEU as a consequence of the power generation. Is that correct? Is there a way to lower that tendency to boost that level of intensity?
I should have been clear. This is on, right?
Yeah.
The HEU is not usually used in power reactors. That usually uses LEU. I mean, enrichment of 3 to 5%. The HEU is usually used in research reactors that are smaller reactors used by universities or governments, or sometimes in this certain companies in this medical isotope production field. It's not a result of the production. You're maybe thinking of plutonium, which is produced by anytime you irradiate uranium in a reactor, you get some plutonium as a product of it. But you don't, HEU is manufactured specifically up front. It's not created by the reactor.
Okay, other questions? Yep, Marilyn, while you're here in the front.
Sachs. And my question to you is, when Korea decided to host the 2010 big event, was there any kind of knowledge transition from the U.S. team that previously held, or that sort of kicked off the initiative to Korea?
Oh yeah, there was close cooperation between the U.S. and Korean teams. I mean, through the summit. They didn't just sort of hand it and walk away. I mean, they worked very closely, and I assume the U.S. will work very closely with the Dutch. I assume the Koreans will be working with. In terms of a formal process, how formally and what role, sort of up to the Dutch, essentially, to decide.
Okay. So setting up the agenda and also, basically the U.S. work with Korea.
Yeah, I think the U.S. had its suggestions, and the Koreans tweaked it in certain areas, like the idea of safety and security, trying to get safety into the agenda, trying to get radiological sources into the agenda. I assume the Dutch will have some, they, for instance, have a very big interest in nuclear forensics, which is determining kind of where material, if you find the stolen material, where did it come from? I assume that will play a bigger role in the next summit.
So then, therefore, do the other countries sort of resent that, there is U.S. leadership behind the entire initiative?
Well, I'm sure, some countries resent it. I think I don't think the U.S. is, or the Koreans were, they try to make it a consensual process. I don't think they sit there and kind of say, this is the agenda. They have these, there's a number of meetings, preparatory meetings every few months. There's what's called the Sherpa, which is the leading kind of person for each country on the process. And then there's this interesting nomenclature. There's a Sous Sherpa, which is the deputy person to the Sherpa, who's sort of more of the day-to-day working level person. And they have meetings every few months that kind of build up the agenda, build up the ideas. So it's not like, okay, we have, here's the meeting you're going to take place. It's, here's our thoughts, comment on them.
Ongoing process.
And the U.S. and the Koreans would produce a draft, but I don't think there's not many things that they did without kind of trying to get people's buy-in to the process. I think the danger is more actually the opposite, which is that everyone's trying to get so much buy-in that you ultimately get buy-in to nothing. It's this kind of consensual UN type, least common denominator result you get a lot of times.
Thank you.
Questions? Chad in the back.
Chad Carroll from the Korea Economic Institute. You mentioned earlier about the potential for the conference to get pushed along to the UN or IEA in future years. But obviously in doing that, you would have to make it fully universal and invite all countries. Do you think, just going from what you've just been talking about, that might risk holding things up and slowing progress even more in future? Thank you.
Yeah. To be clear, it's not a convention that I'm talking about putting to the UN. It's the kind of the results of the process or leadership of the issue or to the IEA. But yes, I agree with you. I think the reason this stuff isn't moving forward, the IEA already has some role in this and could have more, but the reason it's not doing that is because politically, the IEA has a lot of other issues that either it has to take, like for instance, safeguards, it's mandated to spend its budget on. So that's an issue it has to take more interest in. And then there's also what people want to put more interest in. I mean, developing countries are mostly interested in what's called, peaceful uses of nuclear energy, funds for nuclear cooperation, money they're going to get to do research or scholarships or health uses of this material. They're not interested in spending it on security, which is why almost the entire IEA budget for security is a voluntary contribution, not out of the regular budget. So I think, you put it in the IEA, it becomes number 87 on a list of 86 items.
Yes, right here in the up front here.
My name is Sam Lederer, Federation of Electric Power Companies of Japan. I've heard some other commentators in the non-proliferation community say that if other countries gave up their reprocessing programs, that there would be less pressure on South Korea to go in that direction of high reprocessing. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that's really what's driving this, or are there other concerns for the South Koreans?
You mean other countries like Japan? I think there's a number of things, driving the South Koreans. Some of which I would classify as sort of more rational than others. But I think, one of the things that Japan and South Korea share is that they're both very densely populated countries with not a lot of land. So there's an interest in both countries in trying to find ways that you can minimize the waste so that you have, it doesn't take up as much space. I think that technically the Japanese process is not particularly successful in doing that. The Korean process may be a little bit more successful. There's also in both countries a question of democratic, nobody likes spent fuel. We haven't been able to build Yakumo in the United States. Japan hasn't been able to cite a repository. Korea's never been able to even cite a storage facility, just a temporary place for its spent fuel or high-level waste. So these are very, politically difficult issues. These are democratic countries, so it's also very tough. And I think these are, if you're looking at both Korea and Japan have obviously very highly advanced technical sectors, and a sort of esteem of people in technology for natural reasons. And so there's the idea is, well, we can find a technical solution to what is largely a political problem. The problem with reprocessing, even if you do reprocessing, maybe you can reduce the amount of waste. You still need to ultimately need some kind of repository. So it doesn't actually tackle the problem, it just kind of puts it off. So I'm kind of backing into your question, but I think that's the first reason Korea wants to have this. The second is it involves, they think it'll make it, they're competing internationally against countries like the French nuclear country, Areva, and the Russians. I don't think in this sense they're competing against Japan, because I don't think Japan takes back spent fuel, but these other countries offer kind of a full service. When they export a reactor, they say, we'll provide you with fuel, we'll take back your spent fuel, we'll reprocess it, and so on. Korea would like to be able to offer a similar package to countries in a competitive sense. So those are, two big reasons. And the third reason is the democratic element of just finding a solution. But I think the other part is that it's easier for the government to say, okay, we've got people working on this on a technological problem. We don't have to deal with this political problem. Nobody running for the National Assembly or the Parliament wants to deal with it. So they don't want to tackle what they have to do anyway. And the more they can kind of put it off by feeling they're doing something, the better politicians like avoiding tough choices, and they keep trying to do that. So to answer your question, if Japan did it, I think, it might encourage those same politicians to they think, well, maybe other countries can survive without this. We don't need this to deal with our waste problem. The other thing I should mention is both countries have this notion of energy security, that this is somehow going to take care of their energy security problem. I mean, and which is false. I mean, they have, both Korea and Japan are heavily dependent on imports of fossil fuels in particular. And I think something over 95%, I think, in both countries of their energy resources comes from overseas. But very little of that is uranium, and the uranium that you would need, as opposed to using your own spent fuel, is coming from countries like Australia and Canada. I mean, it's not OPEC you're dealing with here. So I don't see that energy security as a real issue that, I mean, it's used a lot in rhetoric, but I mean, as a legitimate issue for people to cite. So I think, if Japan could make clear that by its actions, that energy security was not a real driver for doing this process, that it could find a way to overcome the politics, that would offer a positive role model for the Koreans to look at a place that managed to find an alternative path. Will it make a determined, who knows? I mean, I asked some of our Korean friends who probably know more about the Korean polity to answer that question, but can't think it would be anything but positive. And I guess the final thing I would say is, if there's one thing I hear from the Koreans whenever you try to bring up all of my various objections to pyroprocessing, it's essentially, but you let Japan do it. They feel that they're, we don't love them as much as we love the Japanese, and by putting these restrictions on them. So if that was not an issue, then it becomes less of a, kind of rivalry, you love my big brother more than me kind of thing.
Other questions? Yes, and then back here, and then we'll go front.
Keynote Walter Booz Allen. You mentioned NGO expert meeting, and I was wondering if you'd be able to comment on your impressions of that.
Well, I think the first panel which I was on was obviously spectacular. I think it was interesting. I mean, in terms of how it took place, it was interesting just because the Koreans were, first of all, very nervous. I mean, our group, the Fissile Material Working Group, which is this coalition of NGOs in the U.S., held a meeting in 2010 for NGOs, and we just sort of did it ourselves, and that was that. I mean, we let the administration know, but it was not kind of coordinated or, orchestrated by the administration. It was our meeting. And we wanted to do this thing happened because we wanted to do a similar meeting in Korea, and the Korean government heard NGOs, which means a different thing in Korea than it does in the U.S. I mean, NGO to Korea means Greenpeace and activist groups. It doesn't mean, the Council on Foreign Relations or the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, they got very nervous, and all these people were like, we shouldn't have an NGO meeting, and then they decided we'll have an experts meeting, and then it will be run by IFANS, which is the Foreign Ministry think tank, and KINAC, which is a government agency that deals with safeguards and nuclear security, kind of radiological control, and so on. So that was sort of the basis of it. I think they did a good, in terms of logistics and stuff, they did a very nice job of organizing the meeting. I think the outcome what was interesting was that the outcome was quite different from the actual main meeting, in the sense that, what I said earlier about these ideas of kind of standards and peer review and some kind of governance structure that's more established than you have now was kind of common among all the experts. There were very few who disagreed with that kind of thesis, whereas the government people were all dealing with these kind of very incremental, small steps and these house gifts. And as government things tend to do, they got very hung up on all these kind of process questions. Who's holding the next summit? How's the communique going to look? What wording are we going to use? It's going to be a summit process after 2014. So there wasn't a lot of long-term vision that was in the actual summit. And, maybe our things are a little too pie in the sky or not, but at least there was some idea of, okay, what do we really want to get done here? And what's the real problem and what's the goal? And I think you tended to get away from that in the summit process.
Question right here. Third one. Right.
Hi, Christian Arnell from the State Department. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on what should be the goals for 2014. And you mentioned Dutch's interest in forensics, if that's a good area, or what kind of thoughts maybe came out of the NGO event.
Well, I mean, I would like to see at least a process started or some commitment to this idea of peer review and a global standard. And if you look at the Australian Prime Minister at the Seoul Summit made a speech where she called for some efforts on peer review. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you might accomplish this. You could talk about, some people said, let's just increase the number, sort of either voluntarily or by some requirement, increase the number of these IAEA missions that go and do inspections, these what are called IPAS missions, into International Physical Protection Advisory Service, that go and check out individual facilities and say, are you conforming to IAEA guidelines? You could, for instance, all the countries that are big nuclear suppliers, like the United States and Korea, and are in the nuclear suppliers group, have already committed to have certain standards, said we'll have high standards of physical protection when we provide material. But the U.S., I think, is the only one that makes it explicit as the IAEA standard, which is IMCIRC 225, Rev 5. Korea and other suppliers could pledge to do that at the summit. They could also, the U.S. is the only one that even occasionally carries out visits to verify whether the countries are actually living up to these standards. Other countries could agree to do that. I personally, on the HEU area, the U.S. I think tried this at this summit, but was unsuccessful, was to try to have an end date for the use of HEU in medical isotope production. Basically, the only countries that are really standing in the way of that are Russia and Canada. And then, you could either, we've got a proposal that I'd like to see endorsed either in the summit or at least in the industry summit and so on, which is to have what's called a code of conduct for HEU, which would be either governments or industry or other stakeholders would pledge to take certain steps and uphold certain principles to minimize and eliminate HEU. I'd like to see the guidelines go into effect too, but this is another, if we continue to have some of this opposition or as a supplemental means to bring in people that aren't just the governments, this would be another way of getting kind of political pressure and political support. So those are a few things I'd like to see.
Question over here. Right.
Thanks. Ken Yates, Jefferson Washington. What you were speaking about, Miles, is mostly very polite stuff and civilized. That's all very good. There are some less civilized and less polite things going on. This morning's newspaper carried an op-ed piece from a former Iranian official discussing Iran's attitude toward the nuclear question. And it's rougher. We've got Pakistan, which is a loose cannon, more civilized, still rough. India next door. We have China up in the northeast, doing things that are probably not well known. Then there's North Korea, which has uranium deposits of its own, which makes everything kind of scrambled. And would you see the next summit process to be a little bit harder edged, perhaps, and less polite in terms of those nations that are outside the pale?
Well, I think it's important to separate what we're talking about here, because what you're talking about, I agree, those are all huge problems. Are not encompassed in nuclear security generally, which has been really about non-state actors, about terrorists getting materials. Which is part of the reason, which has actually been very useful and interesting, that you've been able to bring in. In this process, unlike the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty process, you've been able to include Pakistan and India and Israel, which were not, they don't go to these non-proliferation treaty review conferences because they haven't signed the treaty, and aren't under its terms. And the idea, in a sense, this should be a relatively easy issue to solve because it's states dealing with non-state actors. We should all agree that, we should have monopolies over the use of this material and weapons. It shouldn't be going to terrorists, right? I mean, who can kind of argue with that? And even here we have political problems. Those problems, if you brought that into this process, you wouldn't solve those problems and you'd pollute this process. Those problems, we have these non-proliferation, and I'm not familiar with the NPT review conferences, but these things take place every 5 years and we have sort of annual meetings, preparation. And it's just a huge fight that gets nowhere every year because you get this, we get this basic dimension generally between sort of the nuclear halves, the U.S. and the Russians and the other members is P5, the Security Council members and so on, and then the nuclear have-nots, whether it's the Irans or the North Koreans or the, Indians and so on, and the nuclear have-nots say you ought to disarm, and then maybe we'll talk about proliferation, and the nuclear haves say you ought to stop proliferating, and maybe we'll talk about disarmament, and President Obama's Prague speech was some effort to kind of overcome this impasse, and it's only, has had some results, but not what he had hoped, obviously. And if we try to if we get that dynamic into this process, it'll just kill this process. So I'm happy to leave that fight for another day, and and I have employment for years to come because of these people. So.
Are there any countries that were outside of the Nuclear Security Summit that should be at the 2014 one, or are all the right people there?
Well, I mean, there's some question about whether you should, Iran and North Korea were two of the countries that weren't at this process. And, obviously in an ideal nuclear security world, it would be good to include them, I mean, just in terms of making sure their material isn't stolen. On the other hand, you run into all sorts of, particularly with the North Koreans, because they want to be acknowledged as a nuclear weapons state. The Iranians claim not to be developing nuclear weapons, so you could at least say, in the Iranian case, well, you can come here and we can make sure you protect your material from terrorists, and you don't give, which in their case maybe not giving it to terrorists. But in the North Korean case, if you say, will they say that that this somehow justifies them as a nuclear weapon state somehow, that we're acknowledging they have a right to protect this material for their weapons or protect their weapons. The South Koreans, this very interesting way of dodging this problem, which was, we'll let you come to the Nuclear Security Summit if you give up all your nuclear weapons. Which I say would, kind of have as much chance of, Kim Jong-il kind of going to downtown Seoul and kneeling in front of the King Sejong statue. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? So this was, it was an easy way to kind of get rid of the problem in a political sense, but it doesn't. It's an interesting question for the future. I think there might be opportunities at least to cooperate with these countries on, radiological security or other things that are kind of indirectly tied that at least offer some opportunity for cooperation.
Any other questions? Yeah, Alan, right here.
Hi, Alan, Global America Business Institute. Miles, thank you for the presentation. You mentioned briefly at the end of the presentation about the 10-year joint fuel cycle study that the U.S. and South Korea agreed to take upon the power processing issue. I just wanted to get your opinion. I mean, is this study really going to be an honest exploration on the feasibility, the proliferation resistance on power processing, or is this just a formality? The U.S. already knows what it wants, and just trying to kick the can down the road, maybe push a difficult decision to a later time. And if it's the latter, to what extent does it alleviate pressure on the 123 agreement, since this is supposed to be a 10-year study and the 123 agreement is supposed to expire in a few years?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm not sure it's so much an either-or question. I mean, I think clearly the U.S. did want to kick the can down the road, and this will not, the idea is to get this past the date when you have to negotiate the agreement, some sort of renewal. But people also don't know a lot about this process. So even to get to the point of the U.S. may ultimately decide all these things, may go through all this study and it may be proven to be economically and technically feasible. And the nonproliferation feasibility is acceptability is a much more loose term, because I think the standards are harder to figure out. When do you reach that? What's your criteria for judging that? Is it just that you can safeguard it in terms of IAEA safeguards? Or is it really, basically any reprocessing technology you use is so easy to go from that to developing weapons. It's hard to say that it could be non-proliferation acceptable in a general sense, So it sort of depends on what that means, I think. But I think certainly on the technical side, we don't know enough about. They haven't done the whole process. They haven't tried to scale it up. There's a lot of things they have to learn before you can even get to the point of judging whether it's met that criterion. I think my guess is the U.S. would not be too disappointed if those technical steps and so on prove that it's not feasible, and then they didn't have to make a determination about the non-proliferation acceptability.
Anything else? Chad, you got another one?
Oh, yes. Just another question going back to what you were saying about South Korea not inviting North Korea to not legitimise its nuclear program. Well, in a few days, it's going to be the 31st year anniversary of Iraq. And as part of that, there's a UN resolution which called on Israel to enter the NPT as soon as possible. So if that's the case, then why was it legitimate to invite Israel when we're trying not to recognise its nuclear program but not North Korea?
Well, the difference is that Israel never signed the NPT. I mean, we invited India and Pakistan too, and they've tested nuclear weapons, and there's been UN resolutions about them as well. North Korea, on the other hand, was a member of the NPT, acquired nuclear technology on the basis of being a member of the NPT and being adherent to safeguards, and then tried to walk out. That's the difference.
Any other questions? Well, I think we had a great discussion here, Miles. We appreciate you coming in and talking about your paper. We appreciate all of you coming and listening. So why don't you help me thank Miles for his presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you all.